This poem is called Foreigner. I wrote it a while ago when I was still living in Tunisia. I just started seeing this really wonderful woman while I was out there, and I was trying to figure out how to process how it feels when you start something new with someone. And also at the same time, I was learning Arabic as well, I guess more formally doing so. And so a lot of those things were on my brain, and I ended up writing this piece. It has been approximately 703 days since I told another human being I loved them and meant it. It's been about 23 months since I held someone's hand and didn't want to let go. It's been almost 2 years since I let myself imagine a future where I was happy and in love. And I think that in all that time, my tongue has forgotten what it tastes like to say, I love you. Because these days, my I love yous taste like bitter, like black licorice in the inside of my liver, like orange peels and pill bottles in a fine mixture. I can barely say the words with a whisper. What I'm trying to say is that on my tongue, love feels like a foreign language, feels like ajnabi, feels like ghorba, feels like sarab, feels like mahjura. كل مرة أنا نحاول نفسر أحساس متاعي. It comes out sounding like someone else is speaking my words. I heard that when you try and learn a new language, your brain starts making new pathways to run along, a new monologue. But I keep trying to return to the way I used to trust. أنا ما نجمش نرجع لصغري. أنا ما نجمش نصدق كما أنا عملت قبل. ما كيفاش أنا نجم نحل قلبي ونقبل أعمال. I'm just shook because none of these feelings feel the same. I feel the shame of speaking like a child, like I'm in a room surrounded by PhDs and I'm reading off a Wikipedia article in a language I barely understand. Like I need a moment of inspiration, but the lightning is on strike. أما سحبتي كل صفة فيك مختلف. انتي تتبسم كما السر احلاه يستنى في حافل فمك كل صفة فيك جديد كما كل مرة انتي متحمسة يدك يرفرف كما جناح عصفور. And I can't help but speak your name in my prayers. من فايذنة القلب فمي باش يحكي. But these emotions, they make me feel like a foreigner in my own heart. And if I choose to trust you, I'm scared I'll get lost in this new language I'm learning to speak with you because the truth is you scare me. You scare me like empty alleyways in Milasin. You scare me like taxi jamia rides to La Marsa. You scare me like every time I try and speak Arabic but can't quite find the right words انت تخوفني كما كل مرة أنا نحاول نحكي في العربي أما أنا ما نجمش نلقى كلماتي صحيح. I'm scared that knowing you means I won't be able to go back to the way that I used to be. But isn't that the point? Because you will change me. انت باش تبدلني وأنا باش نبدلك. And maybe knowing you means losing all of my old words for affection. Maybe knowing you means learning new ways to tell you how I feel. So let me tell you. أنا ما نعرفش كيفاش نحكي عربي بالقدا. أنا ما نعرفش كيفاش نفسر إحساس جديد بالقدا. ما لا أنا باش نعطيك حاجة صحيح. أما بسيطة روحي في يدك صاحبتي أنا نعطيك ثقة.
How do you think having those experiences from so many different cultures and not just, visiting, but living there and being immersed in everything, how is that fed into who you are today?
Yeah, I'm sure, in a million small and large ways. Few things. I feel like the first thing that comes to mind when I think of that, I remember talking to my dad one time about what it was like when he first moved to Mongolia and they were learning Mongolian. And they didn't really know any Mongolian at that time too. The Iron Curtain had just fallen. So Mongolia was only now kind of like open for people from the West to go and visit and be there. So there weren't even really many Mongolian teachers in Canada. So they picked up a few words, but they got there and knew basically nothing. And they lived with one of the nomadic Mongolian families that would like live in a ger and move around. And that family didn't speak any English. And so that's how they learned Mongolian, was just this sort of like really intense immersion experience. I remember my dad talking about that and sort of saying this, like, one of the, most humbling things you can do, or almost even one of the best ways to enter into a new space is in the posture of a child. And when you can't even speak the language, communicate, ask for what you need or want with the words you're so used to using, it's a great way to kind of like relearn that humility, but also just a good way to be in new spaces. And so I'd say that's one of the things for sure. Growing up in spaces where it's sort of like, I couldn't just rely on the things that were comfortable and safe and secure, but there was a lot of like always needing to be in the posture of learner. Otherwise, I wouldn't make it very far. So that's probably one of the biggest things that stuck with me from growing up around that way.
And I mean, that's one of the biggest drivers for growth is just putting yourself in positions where you're uncomfortable.
Yeah,
and that's how you're forced to adapt. Absolutely. And you're forced to learn in that sense. Yeah. How do you think your journey through poetry and hip hop has allowed you to connect those experiences, but also in a way sort of reimagine your own identity and who you are?
Yeah. I feel like, I mean, I think the biggest connector there is just the element of oral culture that's a part of hip hop and spoken word poetry, specifically rooted in like mostly African and Black art forms, but also Indigenous art forms in different spaces around Canada. Um, and I think that it's funny coming to those things. The reason why that sticks in my head is just because, so like I come from an Irish and Mennonite family. And the Irish are kind of known for poetry, but like the Mennonites definitely aren't, and the Irish, neither of them are known for like their oral culture necessarily as much as like as the predominant part of it. Though some spaces of Ireland absolutely, but kind of how I grew up, I didn't grow up around that as much, except my dad loved to tell stories. But then grew up in these spaces like in Libya or in Mongolia. I think that there was a kind of like a different kind of reverence for the oral arts that doesn't exist as commonly in Canada for some of these old school ones. Like, you know, sure, for maybe like rappers or musicians nowadays, there's a little bit of reverence kind of in that way. But it was really cool to grow up in these spaces where it's sort of like some old dude rolls up and he's speaking a really deep, rich poem in Arabic and like in Fusha, like, you know, like really like intense, high level Arabic. And these like, you know, 13-year-olds are actually going to be like, oh yeah, I'm actually going to sit down and listen to this. I barely understand it, but there's something beautiful and important and good about that. And so I think I was really lucky to grow up around that and to see the power of that, the way it shapes not just our conception of beauty, life, culture, but like also like revolution, change, growth, you know, reimagining, all these sorts of things. And so I think I was lucky to grow up around that, and that was, I think, a large part of my desire to engage again with the oral arts. And then same thing with, yeah, like hip hop. I grew up in Africa with friends that just like loved hip hop. They connected deeply to it. I think there's a lot of youth culture around the world does. There's not a single country I've lived in that hasn't had a hip hop scene, period. You know, it's hip hop and manga. Those are the two things that have been constants in every country I've ever gone to. And so, yeah, lucky to have grown up, I think, in spaces where those felt like constants, even when culture, language, none of those were constants.
Great. Thanks for sharing. And I feel like you are not just an artist here in Saskatoon in the present day, is you're really much a community leader. And how do you think, and you alluded to it a little bit, but how do you think some of those experiences growing up in terms of being so involved in community has fed into you being this leader here in Canada, and especially for the arts and poetry scene?
Yeah, I feel like the first kind of part of that comes to my mind is a little bit more like the latter part of my growing up years. But I remember coming back to Canada. I was going to Walter Murray High School here in Saskatoon. And even though I like, you know, just like ethnically and how I look and everything like that, I think am very much so in the majority in Saskatoon in a lot of ways. I think being the whole TCK third culture kid experience, I didn't quite know how to engage or connect with a lot of the students that were in the classes very easily. But I remember it was my grade 12 year, and it was you, Cody Dill, and Isaac Bond that came to my school, spoken word poets. And I remember y'all coming in and performing. And again, when I lived in Libya, it was a dictatorship while I was there. So there was quite a constriction around speech. And to see y'all come in and, I don't know, just so like unequivocally, like beautifully and boldly like share what you believe, whether or not that was just a love poem or something political. Like I think I was just really like in awe of that, and that's what really made me want to do that. And so I got into it being sort of like, oh man, people will listen to me if I do these sorts of things. And then I very quickly realized that actually the best part of spoken word poetry and hip hop and all these things is the community that comes from it. All these art forms, like think about like the Cypher Circle, like all these art forms are based around like this circle, based around reciprocal relationships. And so I think that idea of reciprocity in the arts and in what we do is important, where it's not just the ego of a performer on stage that matters, but every single member of the audience in that space matters just as much as the performer. And if the performer isn't trying to take care of their audience as the audience tries to, take care and pay attention to the performer, then it's just not a healthy or a good relationship. And so I think that that's really formed as I extend my community work, I guess, outside of the arts. I think that's also part of all of that is just, if reciprocity doesn't exist, then it's, I'd say, a really flawed community, especially when coming in positions of different kind of levels of power and privilege. So,
yeah, great. And I vividly do remember that workshop that we did hold at Walter Murray that afternoon. And I can say is right from then and there, when you approach that group after the performance, you could see the spark and you could see the fire in your eye. And I am, not surprised to see you on your own journey and forge your way and develop into this incredible leader for the next generation of youth that are now coming in. So it's been incredible to see that. Kind of speaking of crossing boundaries a little bit, you obviously don't just relegate yourself to one kind of musical style or artistic style. And I've seen kind of from some of your recent work, you involve jazz, a little bit of improv. How do you kind of try to reimagine who you are as an artist, and how has that growth been for you?
I think there's been a lot of like growth in just how I write and do things outside of the genre elements, but I think it's cool how different genres and mediums like kind of enable freedoms in different ways. I think that spoken word is great in that there's a very limited barrier between you and the audience. You're not going on stage and just doing poems and sitting down. You're bantering, you're talking, you know who you're talking to. So I think like I really benefited from that when I was writing spoken word. And when I was doing hip hop, I think I really benefited from the way that there's this like such a drive to be like, there's a drive to be excellent in all art forms, absolutely. But I feel like in hip hop, just the friends that I grew up around, there's this, like a competitive nature in a way that was actually quite healthy. And like that, I really benefited from. So when I was writing hip hop, I'm like, I can't just sort of like do a poem that's good and that I like. I was like, I want to do something that's the best. And even if I do it and it's not actually the best, then I still felt like I did as best as I could. And that's perfect. So writing hip hop, I think brings some of that out and feeling a little bit more freedom to experiment and try, because the amount of like weird hip hop artists out there that are just putting words together in different ways. And I think most recently incorporating, like hip hop into a lot of like, I'm part of this little punk trio, and that's fun in its own way, where it's sort of like, okay, now there's a little bit more freedom to, I think, express certain emotions that are harder to come out in other genres. Somebody goes on stage and does spoken word and they're just like yelling and screaming, and sometimes you have to know how to harness that and move that in certain ways. And in the punk scene, I feel like there's a completely different openness to it, and a way that like that enables freedom to like open up different kinds of conversations. And so I think it's just lucky that I think words as a base medium fit themselves into so many different genres. And I think all the different freedoms and expertise that each different genre kind of allows an artist is really a gift.
And do you find that they sometimes build on each other? You'll take some things from, punk or jazz, and it feeds into spoken word or hip hop, and it all kind of...
Yeah, I'd absolutely say so. I mean, like when I'm working with like the guitarist in Little Punk Trio, like oftentimes I'm like, hey, like, okay, I've been hearing like Migos has been doing these like triplet trap flows in songs. And I'm like, you just do like hair metal rock guitar, but I want you to try and do this kind of rhythm so I can bring in a triplet flow, but over this sort of like guitar. And then sometimes I'm with a jazz musician. And I'm like, all right, I want this to be actually this sort of like very escalated kind of like loud sort of booming sort of thing that fits here. Or I'm working with spoken word poets and I'm like, hey, there are actually no instruments other than your voice right now, but I want you to use your voice in a way that is able to mimic the rhythms and movement of a guitar or something like that. So you can actually bring a musicality to your performance even when there's no instruments there.
Great, yeah. And so you obviously wear many hats and do many different things. And one of the incredible hats I could say that you wear is you are currently Saskatchewan's 5th Youth Poet Laureate.
Yeah.
How has that role been, and how have you reimagined that role of youth and shaping even cultural narratives and the future of that art form?
Yeah. I think the first reimagining came with reimagining the role of Youth Poet Laureate, being the oldest one that they've had. I'm certainly not fresh out of high school, but it was really cool being like a younger poet that's still, I think, trying to figure out a lot of what he's doing and getting to work with youth. And I know, so Pisa Cantade is our current poet laureate. She was a poet laureate, youth poet laureate in the past. And I know that a lot of like when she thinks about poetry, she often talks about wanting to reimagine it or make sure that like the culture understands that poetry is for everyone. And so I think what's been interesting is, like when I've been working a lot with youth, even before this role, always going into high schools, working with elementary schools, what it looks like, I think, to make poetry feel accessible. But I think the reimagining comes when I think sometimes there are a lot of teachers out there that like have a passion for English and the arts and don't always know how to touch or interact or work with poetry. And so the way that they teach it ends up being a little bit stiff. It's just Shakespearean, it's sonnets, it's structure, it's limited, and it's just maybe academic or not nearly as, I think, revolutionary as poetry has historically been. Like poetry is the genre of literary arts, I think, that loves breaking the rules the most and reinventing and refolding on itself. And so I think working with kids, one of my favorite workshops to do is just going through the history of hip hop and history of spoken word and like linking it together with like beat poetry, jazz poetry, all of the roots there, and talking about the way that like just in the last 100 years, the amount of times that genre has been reinvented and reimagined over and over again. And in ways not just for frivolous, frilly reasons, but to fit the current culture and what people want to see from the art form. So I think I've really enjoyed doing that as a youth poet laureate, going to work with youth and talking about how poetry does actually, like by nature, it should be breaking barriers and breaking things down instead of just fitting into a certain form.
Yeah, and I really appreciate you saying that, because that was for sure one of the big eye-openers for me as a young kid. Seeing art or even poetry was knowing that you go through school and there's very much a right and wrong way to do pretty much everything. And then stepping into art as a whole, or writing, and just saying, there is no wrong way. Can you do better? Can you improve your own skills, sharpen up your tools and all that? Of course you can. But really, your approach is your approach. And so it's one of the blessings of creating and being creative in general from that lens. Speaking of being creative, what does your creative process look like when you're trying to reimagine a new piece or a project? What does it look like for you?
Yeah. I love when I get to hear, I feel like there's a common question to ask artists, and I love when I get to hear artists that have this like, I don't know, like this like wild magician's version of these sorts of things. I always think like, it's so funny when I talk to like my grandma or something like that. Like my grandma loves being like, oh, what a gift, you know? And I'm always like, I feel like sometimes there's almost like magic that people have when they talk about things. And for me, my process is actually like, it's quite technical. I feel like sometimes me getting into a very emotional space where I'm just like reacting takes a little while. So like my process oftentimes is very much a Frankenstein of like, I just go through my life, and when something happens or there's something that's going on or I'm feeling a certain emotion, I need to process that. And I write down a few lines here and a few lines there, or I hear a piece of music that I'm like, that's really good. I'm going to add it to my list of things I want to sample in a hip hop beat later, or I hear this or that. And so essentially I just end up with this like massive collage of words, phrases, poems, sounds, like songs that I want to work with. And then when I sit down and I'm actually like, all right, it's time to write. I just figured like, what are these pieces are really, I think, most enticing to me right now? And then I start kind of collaging them together, figure out what Frankenstein something together in a good way, and I come up with a few good bones, and then I let that sit for a while. And eventually I come back to it, and if I like the bones well enough, I'm like, all right, I'll finish whatever this piece is. And then we kind of crank it out. And for myself, I think that like, I have a hard time focusing on one thing, but because I work full-time in the arts, I have to like be able to deliver, which is always kind of like a tricky balance on things. So I think that's why like being a little bit more technical with it has helped me actually like maintain the sort of creative process I need to create. But also I think that, yeah, like, I don't know, for anybody out there that has a hard time finishing things, whether it's because of ADHD or whatever it might be, I love having different genres of things that I work in. When I get bored or just unable to finish a poem, I start making a beat. When I get stuck on a beat, I go and I work on my guitar for a bit. When I get stuck on guitar, I go and sit with a friend and we chat out a poem for a bit, you know? So I find that actually is probably the most vital part of my creative process, is involving community and constantly switching between things until eventually something gets done.
Wow, yeah. I got one more question for you. What do you think the future of the creative poetry scene in Saskatoon, the scene that you're so involved with, what does that look like? What is the next generation's voice going to be?
Yeah. Well, I feel like, yeah, like next generation for sure. I feel like, yeah, like the future will always be the younger generation of poets popping up. And in spoken word poetry, like, again, the way that like you kind of popped in and inspired me and things, the generations in spoken word poetry is so short. Like, it's not like there's like a 20-year gap, you know, it's like, there's not that many years difference between us, but you were still the generation before me. And then after me, there's already been multiple generations before the youth that are coming up now. So like the future will always be where young people are at, which sometimes is a real mystery to me. I'll go into schools and I'll be like, I have no idea what we're talking about, what's being said right now, but y'all are brilliant. When I'm to think about like maybe what it is that like Gen Z or Gen Alpha will actually want to get out of poetry, I'd say like number one is actual, yeah, like freedom within it, applicability to life. I think that just like the life situation that like Gen Z kids are writing in, whether or not it's because we're talking about climate or housing or just the general political sphere, is so different than like a, like, you know, I don't know, a Gen, what do I call Gen X, you know, poet would have been writing about, right? And so I think that like the way that we communicate is also so different. Like I think that short form content is, you know, it's so big right now just because of all of the ways that we incorporate things, the way that it stimulates all of the serotonin sensors in our brains. But I think I do actually see a lot of that coming out with a lot of poetry. When we run poetry slams now for youth, they're not coming up and sharing 4-minute poems. They're not always asking, can I push the time limit? They're sort of like, they got a 3-line poem and they're done. You know, they're like, this was it. This is what I need to say, which actually I really respect. And like, I think the next generation, I'm excited to see, I think, the way that poetry will have to integrate itself into all sorts of other genres and work. I think that more and more so there's, you know, it's always been like this, but like a dwindling amount of possibility economically and financially for somebody to make a living as a poet, just page poet, you know, just as someone who just sits and does words. But I think that there's all these other avenues now that people are having to be resourceful to find out, to be like a poet in a punk band, or a poet who works with these visual artists, or a poet that engages in some way with, again, Peace is a great example of this interdisciplinary poet. And I feel like that's probably the next stage, partially because of, by nature of needing to, just to survive, and also partially because I think, yeah, like young people are hella creative.
And it seems like young people don't want to be put in boxes.
No, yeah, they
really
that.
reject that
Yeah,
more than
absolutely.
previous generations.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah. The future is bright.
Absolutely, 10 out of 10. I'm very excited for the future. I mean, for the youth in the future. I really, who knows what the future itself will hold.
Great. Well, thanks so much, Dash.
Yeah, pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.